Hello world historians, and welcome to our short video comparing Mesopotamia and Egypt. Also the subsection title of one of the chapters we've been reading for this class, chapter 2, emphasizing Robert Strayer's three C's: comparison, change, and connection. But when we're looking at this guy standing up to his knees in a swollen river, we have to remember that river valley civilization is almost universal. This is not just limited to the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Mesopotamia or the Nile River in Egypt, but almost every civilization that developed writing, the wheel, agriculture, politics, religion, and so on, begins by the side of a river. And Strayer makes the case, I think persuasively, that geography is not destiny, but geography is certainly important. So you need the water, obviously, for agriculture, but you also need, on top of that, if you want to develop into a civilized urban society, as we've seen already in the previous video, you need politics, you need social structure, organization, you need engineering, and you need the developments of technology and specialized knowledge. It's also worth pointing out, again, geography is not destiny, but geography can sometimes shape the character as well as the form of societies. So one thing to note, both the Nile in Egypt and the Tigris in Mesopotamia and the Euphrates flooded on an annual basis. And this flood was very important for the agriculture because it meant that the hinterlands of these river valleys would receive the rich mineral deposits from the water. But it's also worth pointing out that nature is an extremely brutal and capricious force at times, and the floods of the river valleys tended to do damage, obviously, to human life, to settlement, and the creation of agricultural civilization was an attempt to engineer, attempt to somehow tame and manage these natural forces. But it was actually much more difficult in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris and the Euphrates, because these rivers were angry. These rivers tended to not only flood, but flood in ways that were very destructive. By comparison, the Nile was a relatively benevolent force, and so the Egyptians create their Nile embodiment of the Nile as the mother goddess Isis in their religion, who is seen as a benevolent mother. In the Mesopotamian religions that emerged, the gods were seen as much more unpredictable, much more violent, much more dangerous, and this, I think, is to some extent a reflection of the natural environment. Now, Herodotus, who was the not only well-known Greek historian, but said by many people to be the father of modern historical discipline, described Egypt, and this was in the 5th century BCE, described it as the gift of the Nile. And I think we can still see from this photograph taken from space the importance of the Nile Valley to this regional civilization. Egypt itself is a very large country, as we can see on this map, but if you look at the green areas, the fertile growing areas, even though ancient Egypt was perhaps less desert than it was today, it's still very much a little ribbon of green in a sea of desert. When we talk about Egypt, we have to remember that at one point there was two separate kingdoms in Egypt, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, and around 3,100 years BCE or thereabouts, these two kingdoms were united. So you have Lower Egypt, again, pointing out the obvious fact that Lower Egypt is north and Upper Egypt is south. But upper and lower here refer not to the compass points, but to the flow of the Nile River, which flows north into the Mediterranean. Further south, towards the source of the Nile River, you also had what we would describe today as sub-Saharan Africa, Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush. And Strayer notes in his textbook that not only were these kingdoms to the south, although they were culturally distinct from Egypt proper, they were very much integrated into the Nile Valley civilizations. The Kushite noble families, for example, would send their children to be educated in Egypt. and Strayer actually makes the point that the Nubians, for a period of about 70 years, actually governed Egypt. But when we think about Egypt proper, we tend to think, of course, about the pyramids. And this brings us, of course, to another point of comparison with the Mesopotamian civilization. You can see here the scale of these pyramids just outside Cairo. This is human proportion. But when we move to the nearest equivalent that you might find in the monumental architecture of Mesopotamia, this is something that we refer to as a ziggurat. And it looks on the surface very similar to a pyramid. The top is a little bit shorn off in this instance. But the two buildings couldn't really be further from each other in terms of function, and I think each one tells us a great deal about the cultural values of each society. So if you look at the pyramid, the first thing to recognize, obviously, is the labor that went into the construction of this mighty object. The amount of human hours that went in, not just, I should say, slave labor, but also voluntary labor. And this is really just a tomb. This is a mausoleum for one man, a pharaoh, and it's designed not for the benefit, as we might think today, of the greater society, but it's designed specifically for a purpose. Again, and that purpose is to take the deceased pharaoh from this world to the next, take him to the afterlife. This is a kind of cosmic spaceship, if you like. So this is extraordinary to think about entire civilizations not only creating these objects, these pyramids, but being organized around the construction of these pyramids. By comparison, our ziggurat here is actually a temple. It is a public place of worship, and this is somewhat different than the pyramid. The pyramid is obviously sealed off from the outside, is designed as a tomb. This is designed not only as a place where humans can go and worship their deities, and like the Egyptians, of course, the Mesopotamians worship multiple different gods and goddesses, but this is also designed as a halfway house, a kind of liminal point, if you like, between heaven and earth. The Mesopotamian word that was used to describe a temple translated literally as house of a god. That was the word in the ancient Sumerian language. And the Mesopotamians literally believed that their temples were dwelling houses for the deities who lived in the celestial realm, and that they would come down to earth and literally inhabit these buildings. So this is, again, rather like the pyramid in some respects, both in terms of the scale and the amount of manpower and energy that was put into these constructions, but also because both the pyramids and the ziggurats are seen as gateways between this world and the next world. Just a few images here. This one is illustrating the fact that the Great Pyramid at Khufu was the world's largest man-made construction until 1889, with the construction of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And here you have the Statue of Liberty, Big Ben, the Tower of Pisa, just giving a little bit of comparison. And we also need to remember that the pyramids are not limited exclusively to Egypt. You find similar type of structures in Central America, parts of the Aztec and Mayan architecture, but also within the Nile Valley region itself. When we go down to the Nubian kingdom, modern-day Sudan, you find sites like this one at Meroe, which has over 200 remains of these late pyramids that were constructed after the model of the Egyptians. And to go back to the point about connection, again, we see influence of Egyptian architecture not only in Egypt, but Sudan, and parts of the Mediterranean as well. We start to see this, for example, in the early Greek civilization that emerges in Crete, not so much the pyramids, but influences directly from Egypt and from the Fertile Crescent. And this is just a modern example of the Louvre in Paris. This pyramid here Those of you who are fans of Dan Brown's novel will know that the Holy Grail is buried beneath this pyramid in Louvre. And finally, this is San Francisco. This is the Transamerica building. Most people who would see that would think it's an interesting looking pyramid, wouldn't necessarily immediately recognize the echo of ancient architecture. The other aspect which to a large extent we find in Mesopotamia and to a lesser extent in Egypt is the urbanization of society. Sumer, the Sumerian society, which was the first really kind of urban society in the Middle East. We're talking here the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE. About 80% of the population of Sumeria was urban, which is an extraordinarily high percentage, much higher even than the Egyptians. But again, I think one of the interesting points that Strayer makes is that this level of urbanization cuts both ways. On the one hand, it represents sophistication. On the other hand, although it shows that this is a flourishing, commercial, prosperous society, people were living in cities not because they wanted to live near the shops and go to the stores. They were living there primarily, at least, for protection, that these were walled cities. And this goes to another point of contrast between Egypt and Mesopotamia, which is that Egypt physically, because of its remote location, because it was protected by the desert and by the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, had less experience over time of invasion from outside. The Mesopotamians lived constantly with invasions that were going from east to west, north and south. And that region of the world, modern-day Iraq, has always been peculiarly vulnerable to invasion from the outside, of course, leading up to the 2003 invasion by the United States. So the fact that people were living in cities then is both an indication of the sophistication of these people, but also their vulnerability. And so after the Sumerians, you have successive, different geographical and cultural civilizations which flourish and establish themselves in Mesopotamia. But they're never really continuous civilization of the type that you find in Egypt, which lasts for really a period of about 3 millennia. This is the classical Egyptian society, the civilization which began with the pharaohs and lasted until really the Roman Empire. The other point of comparison and contrast between Egypt and Mesopotamia, of course, is writing. And we've talked about how writing evolved independently in Mesopotamia. The origins of Egyptian writing, hieroglyphics, are perhaps much less well understood. But we do know that the whole process of deciphering hieroglyphics really only began in the 19th century during the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. After the French had invaded Egypt, Napoleon sent his army over to Egypt, but he also sent a team of scholars such as this rather dandy-looking fellow Jean-Francois Champollion, Napoleon's chief Egyptologist. And while they were deconstructing an outhouse and a farm to make way for a road, some of the French soldiers discovered what was known as the Rosetta stone, this piece of masonry, which had written on it in 3 different languages a royal edict from late Pharaonic Egypt. And the languages were actually the Coptic Egyptian, which is Greek influenced, classical Greek, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it was only purely by accident, purely by the fact that these European scholars were fluent in Greek and could read Coptic, that the parallel text was translated. And from this point, you see the opening up of our knowledge of Egyptian culture and civilization. This is something that really came about by accident and reveals to a large extent, again, the contiguous nature, or the contingent nature, I should say, of historical knowledge, how we know what we know, the known knowns and the known unknowns. So that's where I'll finish today. But if you have any questions, drop me a line or feel free to post your thoughts on the forum page. Thanks very much.